and welcome to Material Girls, a pop culture podcast that uses critical theory to understand the zeitgeist. I'm Hannah McGregor.
And I'm Marcelle Cosman, and this week we have another fabulous guest blessing us with her presence. Please welcome Andrea Warner, pronouns she, her. Andrea lives in Vancouver on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Her books include Rise Up and Sing, Power, Protest, and Activism in Music, and Buffy Sainte-Marie, the authorized biography. Andrea is also the co-writer and associate producer of the documentary Buffy Sainte-Marie, Carry It On, and the co-host of the weekly feminist pop culture podcast, Pop This. Her latest book, The Time of My Life, is an exploration of Dirty Dancing as a deeply feminist film, and it came out with ECW's Pop Classic series very recently on April 9th. Welcome, Andrea.
Yay, thank you. It's like such a thrill to be here. And it's just like you did such a beautiful job reading that too long bio. I'm so sorry. I really should have chopped it down.
No, that was my choice.
Oh, okay. Well, Hannah, I blame
Good.
you.
I loved it.
Good.
I loved it.
You wrote so many books. So I've got an ulterior motive with this episode.
Cool.
Which is that Marcelle has never watched Dirty Dancing.
Oh, exciting.
And Marcelle doesn't think that she wants to watch Dirty Dancing because Marcelle doesn't yet know that it is a feminist Jewish film about abortion rights. And so by the end of this episode, the goal is for Marcelle to be like, holy shit, I gotta watch this movie.
Listen, I'm here to represent all of our listeners who haven't seen it so that they are able to enjoy this episode.
Yeah. A sort of entry point.
Yeah. I'm the surrogate for the audience, if you will.
Yeah.
I honestly, like, that thrills me. I love that idea. And I also, like, I have heard from a couple of people who have both really loved this film most of their lives and or have only maybe seen it once or not at all, that like their big takeaway from the book is that they never knew that it's like an abortion movie.
Yeah, it's extremely an abortion movie. But we're not talking about that yet, Andrea. What we're talking about in this introductory segment is the movies that made us thirsty as youth.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Because you open your book, The Time of My Life, by talking about the discomfort of watching a sexual movie as a child. When you're like sort of like a tween, a pre-tween.
Yep.
And watching a movie and being like, oh no. Oh no, what's happening? And so I want to talk about movies that were formative to our youthful sexual awakenings.
Absolutely. Okay. So obviously Footloose, as well as Dirty Dancing. Heathers. You can see that I maybe have some like distressing stuff that we should unpack at some point, but like whatever. Adventures in Babysitting, Back to the Future, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Girls Just Want to Have Fun, and then a TV movie that it is buried so deep in like my bones.
Pun intended?
Yes. In my bones. That like, okay, it's called Dance Till Dawn. I'm a little bit older than you guys, so like maybe it's just like a little off. It's on YouTube. You can watch it in full. It's a TV movie that had Alyssa Milano, Christina Applegate, Matthew Perry. Like it's Tempest Bledsoe. Like it's a stacked cast. Tracy Gold, Brian Bloom. Anyway, stacked cast of like 80s like where are they now people. And it was so significant that my best friend and I were playing Scrabble like a couple of months ago, and we didn't know each other back then. Like we met in college, and we both were like, oh yeah, the word puce. And like, she was like, oh my God, the word puce? And I was like, yeah, Dance Till Dawn. And she said it at the same time. We both remembered learning the word puce from Dance Till Dawn. And so we recently rewatched the movie and realized it's just a movie about like horny teenagers trying to like have it. Well, puce is the color scheme of the prom. And Christina Applegate is a totalitarian sort of like rich kind of, I don't know, you describe her as like, she's not popular, but she wants to be queen of the prom, and she's a controlling sort of fascist, you know, sort of like a classic 80s sort of like rich Republican character. And so she makes sure that the color of her dress is puce to match the color scheme of the prom. So she literally looks like every table decoration. Anyway, it's very funny. But this movie is also super horny in a lot of ways, even though no one really ever has sex. But like there's like
sometimes it's just about longing.
Yeah.
It's longing. It's longing. And all of these movies have an element of longing. And so this is the unfortunate patchwork of my early sexual quilt?
The unfortunate patchwork of my early sexual quilt. The Andrea Warner story. Oh, we got the title for your next book. That's exciting.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I can't wait.
God.
I'm not just the surrogate for people who haven't seen Dirty Dancing. I'm also the surrogate for people who've never listened to the show before. So for first-time listeners just tuning in for all of our horny content, our first segment is called Why This, Why Now? And in this segment, we ask the materialist question, what are or were the historical, ideological, and material conditions for our object of study to become zeitgeisty?
And we are going to be doing some pretty layered context setting in this segment because I want to talk first about why in the year 2024 you think, Andrea, it's worth looking back at Dirty Dancing and considering it as a feminist film. I want to talk about why it was made and became such a hit in 1987. And I want to talk about why it matters that it was set in 1963. Also, it's an 80s movie, but it's set very specifically in the summer of 1963. So we're going to get into that. But why don't we start with the present? So, Andrew, you can tell us a little bit more about the time of my life and why Dirty Dancing matters to you as a film.
I mean, why it matters to me right now is, well, I'll be very blunt. This is the year the book came out, and it matters to me right now because of that. However, while I was like writing it, it was very specifically overlapping with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And that was, I'll be honest, I should have not been as surprised as I was by that particular decision. But I've always lived in a time, and I understand it's happening in America, it's not happening here. However, a lot of parallels and things like that. And I also just thinking about in terms of sort of like courts trying to control bodies and like denying people like affirming healthcare. And I think that there are a lot broader implications with what is happening all over the place. And I think, you know, Dirty Dancing is sort of like a lens through which we can explore that. So I also I really feel quite strongly that like things that are often dismissed as so-called chick flicks or just a dance movie, just a summer fling movie, it just does so much disservice to us, like sort of culturally, and it's so gendered usually as a form of sort of like erasure. And the idea that like something that is let's say like lowbrow is not worthy or can never have much bigger things to say. Like I just fundamentally disagree with that. I think that this movie actually has kind of hugely responsible for sort of like slowly radicalizing me throughout my entire life. And I wanted to give that credit. And I think I've really, I mean, I've always loved the movie, but I think I've really started in the last like 10 years to maybe 10 to 12 years, look back on the things that I loved and started to sort of really ask myself why. And try to borrow some of Hannah's rigor and think about it and really sort of challenge, like there are flaws to this film for sure, absolutely. But it is also doing a tremendous amount of work that I don't think it really ever got credit for. And so anyway, that's why like right now, I think it is important.
Yeah.
Okay, so Andrea, given the context of the film in 1963, remembering everyone that I haven't seen it, why... like, is 1963 specifically an important year? Like, how does that summer signify in the American popular cultural consciousness?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't understand it when I was younger watching the film, but like, you know, in sort of more of the research now and understanding it while I was sort of writing this book, Eleanor Bergstein, who is the writer and the associate producer of the film, said her idea was that 1963 was the last moment of sort of a specific kind of hopeful innocence or cultural like hope that was existing. It was before Martin Luther King was shot. It was before sort of, really fully understanding the US's role in Vietnam. It was just at this sort of precipice.
Right before JFK's assassination?
Right before JFK's assassination. Like so there is this, she felt that was the summer that was like just before a big turning point. And so that's why she sort of contextualized it in this moment.
Can you tell us, Andrea, a little bit more about Baby as a character, for Marcelle and the audience for whom she is a surrogate's sake, and like why for Baby in particular, like she's aligned with this historical moment?
Yeah, so Baby has just graduated from high school. She's going to a college in the fall, I think like Mount Holyoke or something like that. And she has dreams of studying economic development and joining the Peace Corps. So she is fully sort of in burgeoning activist mode.
Okay.
However, she has led a somewhat sheltered life. She is the daughter of a doctor, and we don't know much about what the mom actually does. Perhaps she's a stay-at-home mom, a doctor's wife, like that, might be fitting for that time. And she's positioned as this polar opposite to her sister, who's a couple years older and obsessed with clothes, shoes, and marrying well. And so Baby is the sort of, quote unquote, like less attractive sister who cares about the world and wants to, try and save it. Whereas one of the lines is that like Lisa just wants to decorate it. Lisa is the sister. And these two characters are also sort of constantly sort of competing for their father's attention. And so Dr. Houseman favors Baby quite substantially and obviously, and she like adores him. The intro to the movie is like Baby telling us in voiceover that she's never going to meet a guy as great as her father. And I know there's a squicky factor to it, but it's sort of Jerry Orbach is the father. And you're just like, okay, I can see that. Okay. I can understand. I get it. And so, their relationship also ends up being sort of challenged. And they're only there for 3 weeks. But in that 3 weeks, Baby sort of has to face the fact that she, her privilege has protected her in the way that, she is not really aware of like class differences and the hierarchies of those things. She doesn't really understand that other people have to work and there's like real true poverty and scarcity happening. And just also understanding that like she can pretend to be perfect for her father, but that doesn't mean he like understands her and knows her as a person. And they have to get to know each other as people. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the book, Andrea, that for Eleanor Bergstein, who wrote it and who based it quite substantially on her own life, she had sort of a headcanon that the reason why they have gone to Kellerman's this summer, which is this Jewish summer camp for families. Confusing. The premise of summer camp for families is confusing to me, but I understand it's a thing that exists. And that part of the reason why they've gone and like maybe gone kind of late, like the camp's already underway and they sort of show up midway, is because Dr. Houseman doesn't want Baby going to the March on Washington, which is happening that summer.
And so that is very subtly, like deeply layered. And when Eleanor Bergstein talks about it, I feel like that's the most explicit we understand, like what that reference is. I for sure did not sort of understand that when I was younger at all. Like that this is a keeping her away from sort of, he's happy to have her be a theoretical activist, but he doesn't want her to be like showing up in spaces where potentially she's at risk.
That seems like a very familiar parental anxiety, right? That like, it's good that my children have these political feelings, but please don't go somewhere that you could get tear gassed or hit with a baton, which is like, okay, so it's not okay for me to go, but it's okay for all these other people to go. That's weird.
Yeah. Well, and that hypocrisy of like, you believe in this theoretically, but when it comes to the actual practical application of these politics in the real world, they become unseemly to you, is like, a big part of the narrative tension when Baby helps a dancer at the camp procure an illegal abortion.
Yeah, that's like a significant moment. She has to go to her father. She lies to him she just says she needs money. She won't tell him what for. The trust between them, we're meant to understand, is so solid that he just says, well, I know you'd never do anything wrong. Is it for something illegal? She says no. And he believes her. And she gives this money to Penny, the dancer. And it backfires kind of horribly because it ends up being like a real sort of back alley abortion job, which Penny ends up being extremely sick, almost dies. And Baby has no choice but to go get her father to try and save Penny's life. So there are these like sort of repeated, and then he is furious. You know, I mean, it doesn't change the way that he cares for Penny and like gets her well and like does his due diligence as a doctor. But, you know, he uses phrases then after like these people. And that's a real sort of like, I think, slap in the face for Baby. And there's this like, honestly, Marcelle, like if you ever watch this movie, the beautiful moment of confrontation where Baby confronts her father and just challenges his hypocrisies in sort of the context of their lives. And that it's like, it's one of the most perfect moments of like child confronting parent then sort of like having to sort of sit with like, oh my God, I'm not exactly the person that I had always sort of hoped to be for my child. And it's devastatingly emotional. I have watched this movie hundreds of times. I cry every single time in this scene. It's incredible.
Gonna hold you to that. We're watching it together this weekend. If you don't cry, I'm gonna be furious.
Yeah.
So to take one more sort of context step back, right? We've got like why we're thinking about this movie right now, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. We've got like 1963 and the role it plays in the American cultural imagination as this like sort of last moment of a potential that then was, you know, swept away. What's going on in the 1980s? And I'm particularly interested, Andrea, in hearing you talk a little bit about the challenges that Eleanor Bergstein faced in getting this movie made. Because we think about it now as like, to paraphrase ECW, a pop classic. But there was some resistance at the time.
Oh, yeah. She went through a lot to get this film made. She was told at every turn that what kind of people dance like this? It was scandalous. She kept getting rejected by studios. They loved the music and the sort of soundtrack that she had created, but they did not see really like a lot of value in a movie that was basically just about like a bunch of thrusting. They kind of sort of like were dismissing it as, you know. At one point, one of the signature moves in the tango that Penny and Johnny do in their routine that then Baby has to learn is a leg going up onto Johnny's shoulder and it being like, it's a very like dramatic, flexible, meant to be sort of sultry sort of move. You know, hence the title Dirty Dancing. And like, while they were like making the film, one of the film editors, I think it's a film editor, was like, what kind of woman does that? And like, Eleanor had to be like, that was actually my signature move. So things like that. She also is quoted at one point as saying that she literally got up on top of a table to dance to like show why this was like so compelling and things like that. So, and everyone turned her down, you know, everyone turned her down for a long time. Eventually, one of the big studios sort of took it on, and then they went through a bunch of like layoffs and stuff like that, and it bounced around. And then a little video production company picked it up, and they were just going to like show it in like a theater or two or whatever, and then, you know, sort of be straight to home video, thinking it would be okay. And it blew up in a way that nobody had ever anticipated. And I think there's so few films in the 80s, particularly in the 80s, and let's say now still, that like it sticks with Baby's gaze the entire time. It's like its main character, and her story is sort of the most fundamentally important thing. And we almost never stray, like Baby's in almost every scene. There are maybe 2 scenes that Baby's not in, and they're very brief, and they're all about like Baby's character and how she's great and brave and, you know, yes, flawed, but like still trying. And it was just such a rare piece. And then obviously like Eleanor deciding to make the abortion is the crux of the story. So the abortion drives all the action. And she talks about how she did that on purpose because she knew at some point someone was going to ask her to take the abortion out. And if she takes the abortion out, the movie does not exist.
There's no narrative otherwise.
Right.
There's no narrative. It all falls apart.
Baby learns to dance in order to replace Penny at a dance that Penny can't do because she's going to be getting an abortion. So that is the only reason why Baby and Johnny are spending time together, and everything unfolds from there. It's a very smart way to make sure that the studio can't retroactively take your abortion out.
Yeah.
It's so subversive and brilliant. And I just was like, this was a genius move on her part. Like, whatever anyone else can ever say about Eleanor Bergstein, incredible foresight to do that. And her reasoning for doing that is that she felt, she had lived at a time where she had no rights, and she knew that they were tenuous in a way that I never did.
Yeah.
So, Andrea, you said that the movie kind of blew up, and that wasn't something that anybody really expected. Was there something particular to the 1980s that maybe led to it being the hit that it was when it came out?
I mean, I think that sort of we'd had these bigger dance movies that had been sort of seismic tentpoles, like Flashdance and Footloose had been big movies at the time already. I'm sure there are others that I'm just sort of missing out on. I think that soundtracks were significant in the 80s in a way that, we had started to see in the 70s, but like soundtracks in the 80s became huge. And this soundtrack went to number one. It ended up spawning a second soundtrack album of all the other songs that hadn't made it on the first one. And then it spawned a third, which is the collected works, where the soundtrack is all the songs in order that they appear in the film.
Oh, good. That's important.
It's really wild. And I mean, I also think that like the 80s were sort of this kind of, we're starting to get into like it's a very conservative sort of time.
Mm-hmm.
It's Reagan, baby.
It's Reagan, baby. And, it's this sort of conservative time, but you still have this sort of like underbelly of this resistance that people are still trying to fight for. This movie does that. It looks like a summer fling romance dance movie. It's called Dirty Dancing. So you think you're getting one thing, and then suddenly you're just fighting for abortion rights 10 years later, and you don't even really fully understand why.
As I was reading The Time of My Life, Andrea, I kept thinking about this question of like, why in the mid 1980s are we making a movie set in 1963? And like, what is it in that historical moment of the mid 1980s that makes viewers want to return to the summer of 1963? And that, what you call a period of a belief in the possibility of fundamental systemic change. And thinking in particular about like, okay, how is this also a history film? Like that's doing a particular kind of political work around the use of history.
I think I sense some theory coming, Hannah.
Yeah, you know what, Marcelle? You do.
Well, now that we've got some historical context under our belts, it's time for The Theory We Need, the segment where we introduce some critical theory to help make sense of our topic.
Oh, and get ready, folks, because I read some Marxists. So I want to talk about nostalgia and the uses of history, as in, why do we look back at particular historical moments and how do we make use of those moments from the perspective of the present? And so we're going to begin, as we so often do, with a dead white Marxist. That's how we love to start a theory section. This time, I think it's a new to us dead white Marxist. It's Fredric Jameson.
Oh my God.
An American literary critic whose critique of postmodernism was deeply informed by Adorno and Horkheimer's discussion of the culture industry. Marcelle, could you remind us what Adorno and Horkheimer's whole deal with the culture industry was?
So the way that I summarize Adorno and Horkheimer is that ultimately they really felt that popular culture anesthetized the working classes and would prevent the working classes from, rising up and fighting for revolutionary change. And, in some ways, they were right. In some ways, we do, in fact, use popular culture to escape from the, struggles of reality.
Yeah. And part of their point was like the aesthetics of popular culture are designed to be so like repetitive that it like lulls your brain into a state of sort of uncritical complicity with capitalism. Anyway, so Jameson's really on this everybody watch out for pop culture bandwagon. His best known book is Postmodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. It's essentially an argument that postmodernism is characterized by a collapse of high culture and popular culture. So like when we think about postmodern art, it's like a lot of like incorporation of pop culture aesthetics and reference, and that enthusiastic incorporation of all the things that like Marxist theorists were critical of about pop culture is I guess bad is what Jameson is saying. He says that postmodernists don't only quote mass culture, as in his example, James Joyce did. What James Joyce did, good. Quote, good. What postmodernists do, bad, because they are, quote, incorporating it into their very substance, end quote.
So I'm not sure about the timing here, if this counts, but like, does Andy Warhol's Campbell's Tomato Soup and Marilyn Monroe pop icon art, are those the kinds of things that Jameson is talking about?
For sure. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. He also, and I'm going to make Andrew read a quote about this in a moment, but he's also talking about like George Lucas movies, and right? So he's interested in a lot of the like high culture of the 1970s and 80s that was also unabashedly interested in pop aesthetics. So one of the examples that he spends some time on is this category that he calls nostalgia films, which are films that are made nostalgically about the past. And he says that it's an example of like postmodern aesthetics fixation on surfaces and images and fashion rather than the substance of things. So, Andrew, I'm going to ask you to read a little Jameson for us.
Quote, nostalgia films restructure the whole issue of pastiche and project it onto a collective and social level, where the desperate attempt to appropriate a missing past is now refracted through the iron law of fashion change and the emergent ideology of the generation. The inaugural film of this new aesthetic discourse, George Lucas's American Graffiti, 1973, set out to recapture, as so many films have attempted since, the henceforth mesmerizing lost reality of the Eisenhower era. And one tends to feel that for Americans, at least, the 1950s remained the privileged lost object of desire, not merely the stability and prosperity of a Pax Americana, but also the first naive innocence of the countercultural impulses of early rock and roll and youth gangs, end quote.
God, what a bummer.
Have you ever heard a critical theory passage that is more old man shouts at clouds?
Wow.
Like the kids these days with their rock and roll and their youth gangs.
So what's Jameson's actual issue? I assume he's not actually shouting at clouds, but
it's not actually shouting at clouds. His issue is the way that pop culture in the postmodern era represents history and turns it into this like pastiche of surfaces and glossy images and stylish fashions. We can think like probably one of the most extreme examples of this might be Greece. And like Greece's imagination of the 1950s, which is so fundamentally divorced from anything that was actually happening in the 1950s. It's like a theme diner of a movie. And it's that like, these texts have nothing to do with the actual past. They're just interested in the aesthetic surfaces. And as a result, nostalgia films both efface and commodify history.
So does does the critique assume the possibility of representing history in a way that's accurate or true? Or is it like, no, that's impossible?
It certainly seems to think that there's like a better way to represent history, or that like there's a right way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an argument that other sort of more pro-postmodernism scholars have sort of rebutted Jameson with. Probably most famously, Linda Hutchin in The Politics of Postmodernism was like, you actually can't, like, when you're representing the past, you're always just creating a series of images. Like, a representation is always a representation. She writes, quote, "There is no directly and accessible past real for us today. We can only know and construct the past through its traces, its representations," end quote.
But like, does this mean that all representations of the past are nostalgic?
Not necessarily, but what it does do is encourage us to think more about what a nostalgic representation of the past is up to politically and aesthetically, which, you know, to be slightly more fair with Jameson, that's ultimately what he is also asking. Like, what's happening politically in the way that these films are making use of the past. So I found a fabulous essay by cultural historian Bill Osgerby called "I've Had the Time of My Life, Romantic Nostalgia in the Early 1960s." And it's about Dirty Dancing's use of nostalgia, as he says, quote, "complex and conflicted." And that is all the references we're getting to Bill Osgerby. Sorry, it's a great essay. Goodbye forever. Because the thing that kind of made my brain go like, whoa, was an essay by Russian-American cultural critic Svetlana Boym. I hope that's how you pronounce her last name. It's what I'm sticking with, called "Nostalgia and Its Discontents." And Boym doesn't mention Jameson explicitly, but she's very clearly engaging with these like Marxist critiques of the politics of nostalgia. And she makes a point about nostalgia's use of the past that I find really fascinating, and that, Marcelle, I would like you to read, please.
Very good. Quote, "Outbreaks of nostalgia often follow revolutions. The French Revolution of 1789, the Russian Revolution, and the Velvet Revolutions in Eastern Europe were accompanied by political and cultural manifestations of longing. In France, it was not only the Ancien Régime that produced revolution, but in some respect, the revolution that produced the Ancien Régime, giving it a shape, a sense of closure, and a gilded aura. Similarly, the revolutionary epoch of perestroika and the end of the Soviet Union produced an image of the last Soviet decades as a time of stagnation, or alternatively, as a Soviet golden age of stability, strength, and normalcy, the view that was prevalent in Russia by the year 2000. Yet the nostalgia that I explore here is not always for the Ancien Régime, stable superpower, or fallen empire, but also for the unrealized dreams of the past and visions of the future that have become obsolete. A history of nostalgia might allow us to look back at modern history not solely searching for newness and technological progress, but for unrealized possibilities, unpredictable turns, and crossroads." End quote. Okay, before we talk about this very long quote, can we just clarify what Ancien Régime is? Is it just the old regime?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally French for the old regime.
Yeah.
But it's like the version of France before the French Revolution.
Okay, so with the Dauphin.
Yeah,
Versailles.
and, you know, Versailles and the opulence and the Marie Antoinette of it all. And that's a thing, like, historians have pointed out that, like, the popular imagination of Marie Antoinette has very little to do with who she actually was or anything she actually did or said. And that has a lot to do with the way that retroactively, after the fall of the monarchy, the Ancien Régime, a sort of collective imagination of what that period was like and what it meant gets generated. So part of her argument here is that in the wake of revolutionary transformation, there's a tendency almost to romanticize and become nostalgic for the way the world was prior to that revolution, to like reimagine it I think a really good contemporary example would be Downton Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
That it's like what we're watching is a world right before a revolution, the end of a world of landed aristocracy right before that whole world is going to get, turned around and fundamentally cease to exist.
Mm-hmm.
And from the perspective of the present, it's generated as this sort of idealized period of cultural stability where like everybody knows exactly where they belong. But like that's an imaginary construct that happens from the other side of the revolution. So kind of what Boym is saying here is that a lot of the time historical nostalgia has a conservative function, that it like looks back at the period that like historians know was very bad. That's why people did a revolution about it. But we then, from the other side of the revolution, there's this conservative impulse to reimagine that period as a quote unquote simpler time when we didn't have to deal with the like complex politics of the modern era. And that obviously is like, a conservative anti-revolutionary impulse. And Boym recognizes that there's a connection between that conservative use of the past and the way that nostalgia tends to be constructed by mass culture or popular culture. So she's like kind of agreeing with Jameson to a degree here. She's like, yeah, there's often something really conservative about the way that mass culture makes use of the past. So she points out that like, mass culture has a tendency to give us our nostalgia prefabricated for us. Like, here you go. This is what the past was like, and this is how you feel about it. Enjoy. You're actually nostalgic for the aristocracy. Like, oh, am I? Okay, I guess I am. Okay. But, quote, the prepackaged usable past may be of no use to us if we want to co-create our future, end quote. So essentially it like de-radicalizes us, right? Like it discourages us if we're like handed the past as a like prefabricated nostalgic construct. We're less likely to imagine the present and the future as something that we get to participate in the co-creation of. So the way that we nostalgically recreate the past might idealize an imagined era of like stability and imperial glory, yes. But collective imagining of the past can also be about pushing against the idea of political inevitability, particularly of like the idea that, the present era is always the way that history was going to be and there's nothing we can do about it. And instead, sometimes nostalgia, Boym argues, looks back at a moment that felt like a potential crossroads, right? It's like we can look back at unrealized possibilities, unpredictable turns, and crossroads. So those are moments when things could have gone differently, like moments of potential. And that the use of those moments, a sort of nostalgia for a crossroads when the world could have gone in a different direction, can be a powerful political tool for reimagining what the future might be.
Okay, I want to talk about this, but I want a thesis first. I want a thesis, and then I want to talk about it. Because I think that's really interesting, and I want to talk about it.
You know what? Why don't I articulate it as a thesis statement?
Perfect. In our final segment, in this essay I Will, Hannah will bring together the history of our objective study and our theoretical framework to articulate a thesis statement that we then get to pick apart.
Released in 1987, Dirty Dancing is a film rife with nostalgia for the 1960s, a period that Andrea Warner links to, quote, belief in the possibility of fundamental systemic change, end quote. This backward-facing gaze is evident in the film's ample use of music from the 1950s and 60s, and in its setting in the summer of 1963 specifically, the first summer after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the summer of the March on Washington, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and the last summer before the assassination of JFK. It is possible, then, to read Dirty Dancing as a conservative whitewashing of history, in which the possibility of political radicalization is played out by attractive white people on a dance floor at the very moment that Black people were marching on Washington. This reading is supported by the film's appropriation of Black music, best exemplified, as Warner argues, by the scene in which Baby and Johnny lip-sync along to Mickey and Sylvia's call-and-answer duet, Love is Strange. But, as Russian-American cultural theorist Svetlana Boym argued, nostalgia can also be future-facing and can have a utopian dimension, one that looks to the past for, quote, unrealized possibilities, unpredictable turns, and crossroads, end quote. With its focus on cross-class solidarity, mutual aid, and, of course, abortion rights, Dirty Dancing links a moment of nostalgia-ridden American history to the possibility of radical political change in the present, culminating in a utopian dance scene set to the extremely non-nostalgic 80s hit, I've Had the Time of My Life. In this essay,
Sorry, can we talk? We gotta talk more about the cultural appropriation and the decontextualization of Black art, because neither of you brought that up in our previous segments.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be honest. I didn't talk about it because I knew that we were going to talk about it right now. Is that a spoiler?
Somebody read the script.
Oh,
sorry, so sorry. Well, and it's also a piece that it does get really sort of whitewashed by the film so much, but the dance styles and the cultural dances that they're borrowing from for so-called dirty dancing often have roots in Latin and African American dances, and there's a lot happening musically as well, with taking music by Black artists, but there are specifically only 2 couples who are dancers in the film that are Black, and this is a film that sort of talks and makes a casual reference to one of the owners of the lodge, or the owner of the lodge, his nephew, who is very entitled and bratty and awful, talks about how he's going to go freedom riding. So this movie,
I don't know what that means.
He's going to go join the Black activists doing the freedom rides to get the votes out and march on Washington.
Gotcha.
So it's just, there's a lot of references, a lot of taking from, and not a lot of actual sort of investment in meaningful representation.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the problems of Dirty Dancing, for sure.
Okay, tell me if you two agree with this. It sounds like the movie is about progressive white people in the 1960s.
Yep.
Okay. Specifically, progressive Jewish people in the 1960s.
Oh, played by Patrick Swayze. Oh, is he just... We haven't used his name yet. Are we allowed to talk about...
Johnny.
No, I mean, we haven't used Patrick Swayze's name. Are we allowed to talk about Patrick Swayze?
I guess we can talk about Patrick Swayze.
Yeah, we can talk about Patrick Swayze.
He is pretty important.
Is he bad? Is he good?
No, he's great.
Is he neither?
He is not Jewish in the film. He seems to be perhaps playing a sort of pseudo-Italian family kind of history. Really hard to say. His family, their dreams for him involve joining the Painters Union.
Oh, a good, hearty, working class boy.
Yeah, working class, white American man in a relationship with a noticeably younger young Jewish woman who is much wealthier than him.
Yeah.
Complicated power dynamics.
It is, but also the other aspect is, I would say he's not just working class, but probably poor working class. And a lot of his dance life ends up sort of being related to sex work.
Oh, interesting.
Because a lot of women pay for his time at the summer dance camp.
One-on-one dance lessons.
Yeah.
With him.
And so there's like, that is another further complication of sort of the power dynamic happening between these characters.
Okay.
Yeah. So the appropriation of, Black art, like what makes it appropriative is the absence of Black artists.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a particular and iconic and well-loved scene where, like, after Baby and Johnny are together, where they are like lip syncing along to this song Love is Strange, which is sung by Black musicians, but in that scene it's like sung through their lips. So it's like a quite striking representation of the way that Black people and Black political events and Black activism are being pushed off the screen while the art is being used to create this like nostalgic feeling of like, people fucking love this soundtrack. And also where like a big part of why 1963 is the moment when it needed to be set is like because of Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington. So the absenting of actual Black people sort of does suggest a potential conservative reading and certainly does tell us something about like, how a team of white filmmakers and a white viewership thinks about the appropriation of Blackness as part of notions of like political radicalism. When we're thinking about historical accuracy and the representation of the past, one dimension to think about is the way that as viewers, our expectations about what looks accurate have themselves been shaped by pop culture. I can't remember what podcast I heard this on. I think it's 99% Invisible has an episode about central casting and about the history of casting extras and about the notion of like a type, like, oh, this person's straight out of central casting. And in that episode, they talk about how when extras are being cast for backgrounds in movie scenes, they do not demographically represent the actual population of the places that are being shown, because white viewers, if they saw a background scene that was full of people of color, would be like, what the fuck is going on? Why are you pushing some sort of weird diversity agenda? Like, it would look unrealistic to a white gaze trained to anticipate whiteness as neutral. And so things that we perceive as realistic because they are representing a past in which we understand, for example, that segregation was ongoing, or that, some spaces fundamentally excluded people of color, are often themselves constructs of the media that has trained us to take for granted that the past does not have people of color in it. And so we're used to, for example, assuming that like everybody in the Middle Ages was white, which is just not the case. Like, there were people of color in Europe in the Middle Ages. That's a media production of a white supremacist media industry. But, the other thing to ask when we're talking about appropriation is like, who do we choose as a protagonist? Whose story do we tell? Mm-hmm. Right? And that's one of the really interesting things about Baby as a character, is that she is a young woman going through a like sexual awakening and a political awakening, and it's really radical and interesting to see the world through her perspective. And also, she is a wealthy white person who is experiencing her sexual and political awakening through the appropriation of Black and Latin art, and through like sexual interactions with a like very poor working class man who is a sex worker, who relies for his well-being on being made sexually available to wealthier women.
Now that I know that we can talk about Patrick Swayze and 80s masculinity, I also have questions, again, because I haven't seen the movie. Can you guys talk to me a bit more about his character? Like, what do we, by which I mean you, think of his character in terms of like the kind of masculinity that he is representing for our audience?
Yeah, I mean, for me, when like I think of Johnny is, there's the one part of him that's sort of the larger than life. Like, he's a bad boy, quote unquote, who, has
leather
a
jacket, motorcycle.
Motorcycles, black leather jacket, shirt open to his navel. He literally walks with his hips thrust in front of him. Like, it's just, but yet somehow he does it so elegantly that you don't think of it as a penis forward stride. You think of it literally as just like a hip forward, like sort of dance glide. Like, it's ridiculous. And yes, he's hypersexualized in this film. Like, the camera really lingers on his body for the most part. When we spend all of our time sort of like just almost like fetishizing his form and his ability. But I think what Patrick Swayze does so brilliantly, or did so brilliantly, rest in peace, Mr. Swayze, he brings a real tenderness and softness and vulnerability to the character of Johnny Castle. And he also knows that this is not a movie about him. He is fully content and happy to take a back seat to this film and be a character who is transformed by his interactions with Baby, is transformed by like her different acts of bravery, her different acts of solidarity. She brings this sort of like, obviously, like, we think about hope as sort of being something that is sometimes a result of privilege, but she brings a live version of hope into his life because she works so hard to become this person who can do this professional level dance. He works so hard with her. Their relationship evolves on so many different levels, and she is just the triumph of what she achieves under, like, sort of like in tandem with him. They're always sort of like in this dance, even when they're not literally in a dance room. And I think that Patrick Swayze does like a really brilliant job of making sure that this film always stays Baby's film. And I really appreciate that, like, especially in this sort of like, because 80s is real peak toxic masculinity, macho bullshit. Like, he has like his few masculine sort of toxic scenes or whatever, like, not toxic, but like, he gets to beat up a guy who's like a piece of shit.
Call
and
that
like,
a little
great,
bit
that's
toxic.
good.
But you know what? This guy had it
A
coming.
little bit toxic, but like, I mean, honestly, this guy is like, he's a sex pest and he absolutely deserves to be beat up. So, not that I'm like really pro violence, but like, I gotta say, it feels good when he does. A lot of people talk about the end of the film about this being this active, Johnny comes and like saves Baby and says nobody puts Baby in a corner. And like, that is like sort of her liberation. But that is simply not the case. She has already said, about him, like what she has sort of like talked about, like, she's confronted her father. She has said, you have to see me as a real person. And she has said goodbye to him. Johnny has been sent away because of a bunch of other, there's a whole like light crime thing happening as well in like the back. Anyway,
some light crime solving.
Light crime solving has happened as another layer to this film. She has had to sort of openly state that she was sleeping with him in front of, like, the whole camp finds out that she has sort of lost her virginity to this man.
Yeah.
Scandal.
To give him
everywhere.
an alibi for the light crime. Yeah. By saying, I know where he was. Inside me.
Ew.
And I quote.
Exactly.
I'm lying. That doesn't happen.
But she has done all of these things. There are these huge acts of bravery and these huge acts of like standing up for herself, standing up for a person that she believes in, that she knows, she's doing the right thing, quote unquote. And so then when he comes back to the dance room, he enters the ballroom and he says, nobody puts Baby in a corner. He's returning the favor of what she has done for him in so many ways. She has enabled him to be brave, to come back and insist that he dances the last dance as he normally does, to refuse to be shamed, to refuse to be driven out as if he's some kind of harlot villain. It's just anyway, Patrick Swayze, what a dream.
And that final dance, like, the whole thing about them learning to dance together is that dance is a reciprocal activity. Like,
takes two to tango.
It literally takes two to tango. Like, he literally can't just do the big lift on her until she gets good enough to do it as well. Like, it's really about the fact that, like, he can't carry her through these performances. She has to also get strong and like we see so much of her like working really fucking hard to learn how to dance.
So hard. She does so much work.
Okay, you two. What remaining nugget of treasure can you give me about this film that's going to make me go, you know what? All right, I'm going to go watch it right now.
Okay, what about solidarity between women, friendship between women?
Andrea, I just got chills.
And like feminist forms of mutual aid and collective care.
Yes. So Baby and Penny start out in this really like on opposite sides because Baby has all this privilege and she's so young, and she, Penny is this very poor working class dancer who is facing this abortion from this like man that she thought like loved her, and he didn't. He's denying paternity. He's not going to help her. And she's in this like place of real despair because she could lose her job if she, has to go ahead with this. And she doesn't have the money either. And so they start off as kind of foes. And also Baby has a thing for Johnny, and Johnny and Penny are longtime best friends who used to date when they were kids, et cetera. But we move into this other space where like Penny helps train Baby, and they get to this moment right before Penny has to go for her back alley abortion, and Baby's getting ready to go fill in for Penny at this big dance. And they have this beautiful moment of solidarity while Penny's helping Baby get ready and like putting on her costume for the dance. And Penny just finally confesses to Baby how scared she is. And they like hug each other tenderly. And it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful. And they just have this like really beautiful moment together. And then obviously like Baby helps save her life because she gets her father and like, just owns up to everything. But then also Baby's relationship with her sister Lisa is extremely contentious because they've been rivals their whole lives and like sort of trained in this way. And eventually they have this moment where, Baby has revealed that she is a bad girl because she like slept with Johnny, and she's now like ruined in her father's eyes, etc. Temporarily. It's going to be fine. Anyway,
I mean, she slept with Johnny and also lied to him to get money to pay for somebody else's illegal abortion, which
but it was somebody else's abortion, right?
Yeah.
I feel like,
you know what? He's still
I guess,
mad.
Like, he's a medical doctor, but anyway, they make space for this one brief scene where Lisa says to Baby, they're in this one shot together. They're really close together. They're getting ready for the final evening. Baby's very sad because everything has happened. And Lisa says I'll do your hair. I'll make you pretty. And Baby looks at her, and then she's like, your hair's fine. You're prettier your way. And they have this like little head tilt towards each other and sort of side sister hug. And this is 20 years in the making. And they make space for this in this movie. Any other film, this would be cut because who gives a shit about women bonding? And no, it's like, it's part of the heart of this movie is like these relationships.
That's really special. Okay, I'm going to watch this movie.
Yes!
Material Girls is a Witch Please production and distributed by Acast. Why don't you grab a watermelon and mambo your way over to ohwitchplease.ca, I don't know what that means, to check out the rest of our episodes as well as transcripts, reading lists, and merch. On our website, you can also find out more about our 2 other shows, Gender Playground, a podcast about gender-affirming care for kids, and Making Worlds, a video podcast about sci-fi, fantasy, and the radical power of imagining otherwise. Again, you can find out all about all of our shows at ohwitchplease.ca. We also have an excellent newsletter at ohwitchplease.substack.com and an even better Patreon at patreon.com/ohwitchplease. We're also on Instagram, X, and Threads at ohwitchplease, and of course on TikTok at ohwitchpleasepod. Andrea, now where can the people find out more about you and your work, including your books?
Well, I have a website. It's embarrassingly sort of called theandreawarner.com.
The Andrea Warner.
Because Andrea Warner was taken, so I had to go with theandreawarner.com.
No, I love it. The article is important. You are the Andrea Warner.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I have all but abandoned Facebook and Twitter, but you can find me on Instagram at Miss Andrea Warner. And my book is called The Time of My Life, Dirty Dancing, and it is available right now via ECW and all of your favorite independent bookstores. And if you're like an audiobook person, it's also an audiobook available via Spotify.
Thanks to Auto Syndicate for the use of our theme song, Shopping Mall. And of course, thanks to the whole Witch Please Productions team, our digital content coordinator, Gabby Iori, our social media manager and marketing designer, Zoe Mix, our sound engineer, Malika Gumpankum, our transcriber, Ruth Ormiston, and our executive producer, Hannah Rehack, aka Coach.
At the end of every episode, we will thank everyone who has joined our Patreon or boosted their tier to help make our work possible. Patreon support is the way we pay our incredible team. So when we say thank you, please know we really mean it. They would leave us in a heartbeat if we didn't pay them.
They're only here for the money.
They're only here for the money. You Patreon supporters, you make this show possible. Our enormous gratitude goes out to Allison T, Anna K, Krista P, Carly D, Heather H, Quinn R, Caitlin A, Amanda G, Rika KP, Sarah S, Sophia, Catherine, Abigail F, Melina S, Jenny B, Rach L, Sunana K, Mary, another Sarah S, Amanda J, Lisa B, Aaron B, Swords Womph, Emily D, Shannon G, Rebecca M, Catherine R, James W, Mariah F, Kelly LC, Kate L, Delphine K, and Catherine P.
Ooh, thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Obviously, telling you that you'll get to hear about us getting hate crimed at Disney worked, so we'll continue to tell secrets on the Patreon.
Oh, absolutely.
We'll be back next episode to tackle another piece of pop culture through a whole new theoretical lens. But until then,
later, abortion enablers.